Why bread? Have we thought about why bread? Bread? Bread was a basic staple food that supported life in the Old Testament. Different groups of people around that time learned and perfected the art of bread making. It was an important and critical source of nourishment and was the most important element of their daily diet. In fact, the entire meals that they had revolved around bread. So bread was critical to them. It was important. It was one of their main sources of nutrients. The bread that they made looked different from the bread that we will buy from Kiss, the loaves that we would buy. Some were flat, some were round. They made bread with wheat, barley, spelt, millet. In reading, I learned that they even infused oils and honey in making the bread during Old Testament times. So when we hear the word bread, what we eat as bread, the loaves, they are totally different from the bread from Old Testament times. That bread that they ate was the major food. So why bread? Bread was important. Let's look at the importance of bread in the Bible. It was equated with water as being essential for life. There are scriptures that equate water and bread together. We have the example with Abraham when Hagar and Ishmael, when he sent them on their way in Numbers 21 verse 5, I'll read it. Sorry, Genesis 21 and verse 14. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water, and putting it on her shoulder, he gave it and the boy. He gave it to her and the boy. He gave it and the boy to Hagar and sent her away. Then she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. So he gave them not water, which was critical for survival, but bread. In Numbers 21 and verse 5, chapter 21 and verse 5, we read about the Israelites grumbling to Moses, as they often did. And they spoke against God and against Moses and said, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness?" And look at the things they said that they did not have. There's no bread. There's no water. And we detest this miserable food. In 1 Kings 13 and verse 8, when the man of God was being asked to tarry, he had to deliver a message. He said, this was his reply, but the man of God answered the king, "Even if you were to give me half your possessions, I would not go with you, nor would I eat bread or drink water here." So bread in Old Testament times was equated with being essential as water, bread and water. Secondly, bread was shared with visitors. In Genesis 18 and verse 6, and I'm reading from the New International Version. So Abraham hurried into the tent of Sarah. "Quick," he said, "get 3 seahs of the finest flour and knead it and bake some bread." Now, this example of Abraham asking Sarah to make bread for the strangers who had visited, he wouldn't have done it if he knew that Sarah was not competent enough to complete that task within a short space of time. If Sarah was a cook that took long to complete a meal, he wouldn't have told her to make bread, but he knew that Sarah was competent enough to finish the meal on time to provide for the strangers before they left. In Genesis 14, verses 17 to 18, we have the example of Abraham being given bread and wine. Beginning in verse 17, after Abraham returned from defeating Kedorlaomer and the kings allied with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh. That is the king's valley. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, and he was the priest of God Most High. So bread was given, it was a food that you offered to strangers, to people who visited you. It was not only viewed as critical as being as water, but it was also one of the food that you offered to strangers. Bread was part of the tabernacle worship. So in Leviticus 24, verses 5 to 9, we have God instructing Moses on setting up the tabernacle, on tabernacle worship. And these verses tell us about the importance of bread within the setup of tabernacle worship. I'll begin reading in verse 5. Take the finest flour and bake 12 loaves of bread, using 2/10 of an ephah for each loaf. Arrange them in 2 stacks, 6 in each stack, on the table of pure gold before the Lord. By each stack, put some pure incense as a memorial portion to represent the bread and to be a food offering presented to the Lord. Continuing, this bread is to be set out before the Lord regularly, Sabbath after Sabbath, on behalf of the Israelites as a lasting covenant. Verse 9, it belongs to Aaron and his sons, who are to eat it in the sanctuary area, because it is the most holy part of their perpetual share of the food offerings presented to the Lord. So bread was part of the worship in the tabernacle. In Exodus 40, after the tabernacle was set up, we have the account in verses 22 to 23, and there is a representation of the bread on the table. In verse 22, Moses placed the table in the tent of meeting on the north side of the tabernacle outside the curtain, and set out the bread on it before the Lord, as the Lord commanded him. So bread was not only critical to life, was not only given to strangers and visitors, bread was part of the whole setup of tabernacle worship. As we have observed, bread was essential to all parts of daily life. Jesus Christ recognized the importance of bread in the Lord, and in the Lord's Prayer, the need for daily bread is one of the first requests made to the Father. Think about that. So let's look at it. Luke 11, verses 2 to 3, he said to them, when you pray, say, Father, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come. Request, give us each day our daily bread. Early in the prayer, our daily bread. So bread, he knew the importance of bread to the lives of the people he was among. And because of that, he referred to himself as the bread of life. And when he referred to himself as the bread of life, he knew that the audience he was speaking to at that time, they would understand the importance of him following him in their lives, because they understood the importance of bread. John 6:35 tells us, then Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. And making that statement, he knew that they would know the importance of him making that statement that he was the bread of life, because bread was so important to the lives of those people around him. In John 6:48 to 51, later in the chapter, he continued, I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, yet they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which anyone may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. Now, many had difficulties with him stating these things, but now we understand the spiritual intent that he was talking about. So during the days of unleavened bread, we are commanded to eat unleavened bread for 7 days. Such a command would have had an important impact on the lives of people who ate bread in every meal. God could have said, these are the days of unleavened spinach or karaili, or things that we don't eat that we could have done without. But God didn't do that. He used bread because bread was the most important element of the meals. Because if it was the days of unleavened spinach, it wouldn't have affected our eating patterns or their eating patterns in the Old Testament. So as we begin the days of unleavened bread, let's reflect on how important bread is, and let's reflect on our bread of life. Remember, our bread of life is the one that allows us to live forever. Deuteronomy 8 and verse 3 has important words for us, words that were repeated by Jesus Christ when he was tempted. There's a Moses speaking to the Israelites. He humbled you, talking about God, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you this important lesson, that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. So in the next 7 days, we will not be living on bread alone. We will be living on unleavened bread. And as we partake of the unleavened bread, the focus must be on our bread now, the bread of life, Jesus Christ. So that is why we eat unleavened bread during these days, for the focus to shift from physical nutrition to spiritual nutrition.